Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Conversations on Retail. My name is Matt Spicher. I'm excited today to welcome Steve Blair, who's kicking off a brand new series with us, focusing on the roles of leadership and culture in transforming organizational performance. Before Steve begins, I want to remind everyone who's with us live this morning that this is a conversation and not a presentation. Steve's a guy who I've long admired, but only recently had an opportunity to get to know. He's helped some great teams accomplish great things. I know some of those stories will come out in this and future conversations. I'm excited about the series and for the opportunity to learn from Steve and his guests. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve Blair.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Hey, I have had the honor and opportunity to work with some really amazing organizations and leaders, brands over the years. And many of them have had just truly remarkable cultures. And my passion now, my mission is to come alongside fast growing organizations and leaders and help them think about how they can create, curate, and ultimately lead healthy cultures in their organizations. And not the least of the benefits of that is to attract and retain the best talent in this really competitive marketplace. So that's my passion. That's what I'm here to do. I just wrapped up an extremely fulfilling and purpose-filled 7 years with the Harvest Group. I had the honor of leading people and culture there, where we scaled the business from 25 people in one office location to nearly 250 team members in 5 offices in 2 countries. And what's amazing most about that story that I'm most proud of, and what I'm hoping to help others do, is they were able to scale that while not only protecting the culture that got them there, but strengthening and building on that culture as they scaled and as they grew. So I'm honored to bring those experiences to the Culture Collaborative. It's a cohort-based model for people and culture leaders to come around the table and talk about how we can leverage the strengths of healthy cultures and help them scale those in their own organizations. As the title suggests, this is a conversation, and particularly on leadership and culture. I am excited to have leaders on, and we'll have different leaders on each time to talk about their unique experiences, their unique perspectives, impacting cultures all across the spectrum of organizations, whether it's big or small organizations, fast growing or stable growth, or goods and services. This podcast will include manufacturers and brands. It will also include agencies and those that are kind of around the industry. And speaking of industry, with my experience in particular in CPG, and with this being conversations on retail, the conversations we'll have will focus primarily around the CPG retail space, folks that are in that space and folks that are kind of hovering around that space. That'll be the focus of these conversations. So let's talk about culture. As I was thinking about this endeavor with Matt, really 5 leaders immediately popped into my head of leaders that I would love to bring their unique experiences onto the discussion and the conversation. 3 of them have already said yes, and I'm really excited about that. And I'm excited to kick off our conversation, this whole series, with my good friend, Nick Spicher. So Nick is a vice president at the Harvest Group. He is leading and growing clients that they partner with the Kroger retailer. He's based in Cincinnati, and he's leading a team of at least 20. Maybe he'll give us an update on the actual head count, but I know he was over 20 when he and I last worked together a few months ago. Nick, man, I admire you as a leader. I admire you as a creative Enneagram 7. I admire you as a dad and as a friend. And so, man, welcome to the conversation, my friend, Nick Spicher.
Well, I'm really glad that story didn't end with, I asked the 5 leaders I wanted to join. They all said no. And so I had to ask Nick. So I'm glad. Maybe
Nick
that's
was number 1.
Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's the story.
Truth be told, Nick was number 1, and he said yes immediately. So thanks, Nick.
I'm glad to be here, mainly just to get to talk to you. So thanks for having me.
Well, great to see you. All right. Well, I've got a couple of questions, and throughout this, I want you to give us pepper in some feedback or some perspectives around Harvest Group in particular. I want to make sure that because that's a big part of the culture story that you and I have together. But first, I want to just start like I want to start with each leader I have on this podcast, and that is, everybody has a unique definition of culture, and you can Google definition of company culture and you can get, a couple million hits. And so I would just be curious, Nick, with your unique view, your unique background and experiences, how do you define this thing we call culture in an organization in particular?
Yeah, thanks for sharing about the Google. I was hoping I wasn't going to read the first result that everyone gets when they Google definition of culture. No, for me, a couple of years ago, I read an article. It was a Harvard Business Review article, which is such a cheesy drop in general, but and it said culture is the social norms of an organization, both informal and formal. And so when I think about culture, even as we walk into the office here on a day-to-day basis, I just kind of evaluating what are the social norms of an organization. If somebody came and just lived here in our office for a week, what would they say the values are? What would they say the culture is like? And hopefully it's how we've defined it, but they would observe that by observing the social norms, both stated and unstated. And so that comes through language. It comes through consistency of language. Like vocabulary is very important. We have to make sure that the vocabulary across from our leader down to me, down to the rest of the organization has to be consistent. But so I summarize it as stated and unstated social norms of an organization is how I think through what culture is.
I love it, man. One of my favorites is Tim Ferriss describes it as what people do when they're left to their own devices.
Yeah.
And which is very similar to what you said. It's like basically how do people behave? How do they interact within the confines of like an organization, but with their own personality? And when no one's looking and no one's, dictating how to behave, when leaders aren't even in the office or on the team, how do people carry themselves with each other? I think that's a great definition.
What's interesting, sorry, this will end up being an hour and a half long conversation.
Indeed.
So much of our work is external. So we're serving clients. And so our culture not only shows up internally, it's not like we are building something internally, but so much is externally. Our culture has to show up in the 80% of the work that we do, which is really external facing to a retailer or other companies. So that's what we're challenged with, is it has to show up not only in the halls, but as we show up on weekly meetings with clients as well.
Yeah, no, man, you're totally right. And I want to get back to that definitely with a follow-up, but you've had some interesting experiences. You started in public accounting, you went to P&G in finance, you made the transition to the dark side, to the customer business development, or formerly known as sales organization. What was one of your earliest experiences in your career or life? And I'll go back as far as you want, with an organization that had what seemed like a healthy culture. Like what was like the earliest you can remember?
Yeah, I remember, I can go maybe if I'll answer healthy and unhealthy, because it was the same place. I joined a public accounting firm right out of college. And I remember the healthy piece of that is each year, the way the public accounting model works is you're recruiting a new class of folks to work on the business. And it's hard, right? They're sending them right in the busy season. And I had a partner who fostered a culture where he knew that it was going to be 12-hour days in the dark months of winter. And he fostered a culture of whether it was paying for dinner when you're staying at a client late at night, when you were working on Saturdays, bringing in lunch and just encouraging that. I just remember that he built that almost like a locker room mentality. It was like, hey, we're all doing this really hard thing. Let's do it together. And I love that. And it drove for me in my first 2 years of public accounting. That's what I loved about it. I didn't necessarily love the work. I loved working in that like team environment that was led by a leader who understood and had an empathetic approach to that work. At the same time, as I say that, when you were talking about when you asked the question, I thought maybe you were going towards unhealthy. That same office ultimately ended up being led by a new partner. And I remember specifically a very clear moment in the middle of busy season when things weren't going as well for the young. You got 22, 23, 24-year-old kids just really getting after it. And it was just not going well from a culture standpoint. And the head partner's weekly address to the company was like, hey, if you don't like it, we'll get fresh horses.
Oh, gosh.
It's like, okay, well, yeah. Maybe this isn't the place for me. So I just think like how that culture dynamic can shift when you have an empathetic leader who understood how to build locker room mentality morale. And then someone who's like, well, if you don't like it, we'll just get someone else. Like, oh, well, that's a different mentality. So maybe both the positive and the negative there.
And from a vocabulary standpoint, it's always good to call your people horses.
Well, here's the thing. You say that stuck it for the rest of my time there. I mean, that one moment changed everything, because it was like, oh, let's get fresh horses. I mean, that became a part of the vocabulary.
Man, there are so many stories that I can think of that go back to an experience with a leader that was either incredibly lasting. I'll never forget it. I think of Kenny Shields. I think of Kirk Truffles. I think of people in my past that have had I can remember like 5-second windows with them. And I also have 5-second windows with leaders where I wanted to crawl under the table.
I think culture is going to showcase you, just like anything, who you want to be and who you don't want to be. So I think the manifestation of any level of culture we have here at our office is driven by not only, and we'll talk about the macro culture of Harvest Group that was built way before we started, but the experiences I had in my career of like, oh no, I don't want to do that, or like, oh, I love that, I want to bring that to life if I get the opportunity to lead.
Hey, speaking of Harvest Group, just to get everybody on the line, some context, walk through a little bit about the structure of the organization, the role that you play, and then the team that you lead.
Yeah. So Harvest Group is based in Northwest Arkansas. That's where the company was founded, serving clients at Walmart and Sam's Club. And so that existed for 10 years before I joined the company. You would know better. We joined about the same time, but right around 50 people. I got to know the Ross Culley, the founder and CEO, when I lived in Northwest Arkansas, and then moved back here to work with P&G here in Cincinnati, and fell in love with what the culture that was being built through Harvest. And so kind of as I stayed friends and stayed close with Ross, they were talking about expanding out to other retailers. And so about 7 years ago, left P&G to open the Harvest Kroger office here. I've been fortunate to expand. It's a little over 20 now, Steve.
Nice.
And so
Awesome.
Been doing that for the last 7 years. So I lead our Kroger business unit. And then since then, we've expanded to open an office that covers Target. We have a team that covers Amazon, Costco as well. And so what's been fun is I was a bit of the beta testing model for how can we build the Harvest culture in a different city. We also have an office in Tunisia, Africa. So can we build that culture globally, and have been able to see how other leaders have brought that culture to life in other ways as well.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, it's a great case study in an already incredibly strong culture that grew out, right? Grew into multiple locations, also grew in number, and all while strengthening the culture. I would say that the culture now, 16, 17 years in, is stronger than it was 8, 9, 10 years ago. And by a lot of very obvious ways. I mean, it's a great story for leaders like you and Beth in Minneapolis that are really crafting what a multi-level or a multi-dimensional culture looks like. So let's park there for a second. Talk to me about the dynamic of having a corporate culture that's really strong, and then how that translates through the organization. You've got people working on your team in Cincinnati that if they've started in the last 9 months, they've never been to Northwest Arkansas. They've never been to big meeting. They've never been to things that reinforce the culture. How do you make sure they experience the Harvest culture, having be a new hire in a remote market or a dispersed team, and experience Nick Spicher's vision for a culture that's not disconnected from the corporate culture? In fact, it's accretive. It's in support of and in addition to. Walk me through that dynamic.
Yeah, not without many failures. So at some point in time, we can have a list of all the failures and mistakes.
That's a different episode.
Okay, different episode. I'd love to talk about that. Well, I think it's one, I was very fortunate that Harvest had an ingrained culture that I loved, and it's what drew me to the company. So I mean, don't tell anyone else, but I didn't really have any idea what Harvest did when I joined. I was attracted to the culture, which honestly I think is what people, that's how people decide where to work. It's like, okay, I love the job, but I really am attracted to either the culture or ultimately the person I'm going to be be leading me.
And let's be honest, even on your first call at Kroger, I'm not sure you knew what Harvest did.
No, I'm still figuring it out. We're 7 years in. We're all just figuring it out as we go. That's a true story. But so I was able to build upon a culture that I already believed in and was bought in on. I think it's the harder part, the hardest part of leadership is if you're trying to build a team, a micro team culture in a place where you don't believe in the macro culture environment. That's a real challenge. So I feel grateful that I was already bought in on the culture that was established. And then for me, what I wanted to do is to build a team and culture that resonated, that was tied to and reflected the macro culture of Harvest, but reflected the city that we live in and my personality. Ultimately, you and I talked about this before, like we could go organization by organization. Teams' cultures are determined by their leader, by the actions of the leader, formally and informally. So I knew that my personality, for better or worse, was going to have an impact on the culture here. And I knew the city our office is an urban environment is going to have a different feel than Northwest Arkansas. So I wanted that to be reflected, both the city we operated in, the retailer we served, as well as my personality. And I think it's one of the biggest weights that I feel also in good and bad ways is just knowing inevitably, if you like something about the culture, it's probably gonna be something you like about yourself. And if you point at things and say like, that's a weak point of our culture, it's probably gonna be a weak point of me as a leader or in my personality as well.
Man, that's I can feel that weight, right? Of not only you're building something from scratch is what you did in Cincinnati. You're wanting to honor what got Harvest where it was at the time. You're wanting to embrace new people in a new city, coming to a company they've probably never heard of. If you're outside of Northwest Arkansas, and you're trying to do all of that in a way that makes them feel seen, heard, welcomed, belong. That's amazing. And your team is now big enough where you have leaders that work with you, that lead teams. So you actually have at least 2, I think, teams there locally in Cincinnati that are their own team, part of the Kroger team, part of the Harvest Northwest Arkansas based headquarter team. Talk through that dynamic a little bit.
Yeah, I think we've got 2 teams that are multifunctional teams that roll up to team leads, that roll up to myself and a director here. And I think we just had this conversation the other day. If I would have set out, and I honestly, if I look back, and I think I did set out initially, like I'm going to build the culture of, I'm just going to take the personality culture of Harvest Group Corporate, and I'm going to implement that in Cincinnati. Well, that's not going to work because it's not going to be authentic, because I'm different than the leadership and just in personality and total company leadership. And so I had to learn to be authentic. Like I had to learn, like the culture is going to reflect who I am. I better be authentic in the way that I lead so that the culture resonates from there. If there was a gap between who I am as a person and the culture with which I was trying to lead, like people would feel that. They'd be like, wait, I'm seeing the way you act and I'm seeing the way that the culture you're trying to create, and there's a gap there. There can't be a gap there. And so I had to shift that. So I've talked to our team leaders, like, yes, we need to layer up to the culture of Cincinnati. We need to layer up to the culture of Harvest Group. But you got to be authentic. You got to lead through who you are. People are going to sniff out if you're like trying to be someone else or create a culture that someone else created. It's got to be through who you are authentically, again, in good and bad ways or
owned it at least. Yeah, I've always described that as there's got to be an alignment with authenticity, like aligned but authentic.
Yep.
And if you can thread that needle, man, what a especially if you're starting out with a strong overall corporate culture and you align to that, you hire leaders that are accretive to that support that build on that. They don't necessarily just fit in because you want them to have unique personality. And then they can also be authentic and bring unique parts of them to the role. That's the recipe right there for successful culture expansion.
I think the analogy is like presentation style. If I decided I was going to give a presentation, but I wanted to adopt the style of someone who was scholarly and serious, people would be like, what, like that doesn't, you're disingenuous.
What's Nick doing right now?
Yeah, that's right. What's he doing? Yeah. So
what have you done with Nick?
So I just like that's the analogy I always thought. I want people to like,
yeah.
That's an authentic showing up in that case.
Yeah. Hey, let's shift back to something you said earlier. You talked about you're in the client service business. You interact with clients externally. And I hope this won't be too crazy of a question, but I would love to hear first how you describe the harvest culture. Like what makes the harvest culture the harvest culture? And then just fair warning, the next question is going to be, how does that look and feel and experience with clients who observe it from the outside?
Yeah.
So
I feel a little bit ridiculous talking to you about this since you know it so well. And so I and again, would love to share all the mistakes we've made, but the word that I would hope that both our team and that our clients feel is servanthood. Like we are in the client service business. I hope that our clients feel that we take that very seriously. And then the other way that I hope is experienced is we share our values as a company in our new business development pitch, which maybe people do that. Maybe everybody does that. And when we do that, the goal is to say like, this is a way for us to be held accountable. If we're going to before we even work together, if we're going to tell you that we're about relationships and excellence and integrity and journey and legacy, the goal is that if we happen to work together and we don't demonstrate, if we treat you as a transactional relationship, if we don't showcase excellence in everything we do, we're giving you the opportunity to call us on that. And so for us, like I love that we do that up front. That we just say like, here it is. And I don't know whether it resonates or not, but for us, it does.
I think it does.
It also, like for our team, they see like we've already told these people what we stand for. We've got to reflect that on a day-to-day basis. And so I know it can sound cliche or I don't know what the right word is, but those 5 values mean something. It's the first thing I ever learned about the company. Like before, 3 years before I ever worked for Harvest, I knew the values of Harvest 3 years before I ever worked at Harvest. Like I could have told you the values of Harvest over the values of P&G. And because it was commonplace, it was known. And so,
and I think it's known through vocabulary. You mentioned that earlier. It's talked about a lot. They've put a lot of effort into describing what it looks like in real words, which is amazing. And then you've got the vocabulary, you've got the wording, you've got the stories, and then you see people and you meet people and you go to lunch with people, and it's like, man, this is consistent. This is authentic.
Again, not that praise and feedback comes through the lens of the values. So like, I didn't see you demonstrate excellence, or I think excellence would have looked like this, or I didn't see you delivering on our value of relationships by this, or I did. When you did that showcased our value of relationships. Quarterly, any of awards that are given are all based on the values. It is consistent repetition of vocabulary. That is nothing I did. Like it was in place before we got here. Like that, it's been since the beginning that has been that way. And so we see it in clients that we work with, clients who have defined values that are a part of their ethos. You feel it. You feel it with everybody you interact with. I think people are drawn to work for companies who have aligned values. So you can just interact with people and be like, yep, that feels like Nature Nate's. That feels like RX Bar. Like those feel, that's the ethos of that company.
So you mentioned you invite accountability from the very first presentation, the very first couple of slides in the pitch deck. To give me an example of like how that plays out. I think it would be, I would think that a client would say it's unique that they Harvest invites accountability against their values.
Yeah.
How does that actually happen in real life?
Yeah. I will not get too far into the weeds.
Yeah. Or specifics.
Yeah. Yes. Or if I do, really, if I do, you can tell me to stop. Yeah. Part of our model is quarterly check-ins. So we rocks and goals, a lot of things that people are doing specifically on the manufacturer side. What we believe is oftentimes on the agency side, there isn't that level of accountability. And so we align on goals with our clients, annual goals and then quarterly rocks. that we're checking in on a weekly basis. And then we have a quarterly check-in that says, like, did we collectively, not did we harvest or did you manufacture, did we collectively achieve the goals that we said we set out? We put them on paper and didn't adjust them. If we knew we were going to meet them, let's adjust them throughout the quarter. But these are the ones that we said we were going to meet. And so that is excellence. And then what we do is if we did, let's celebrate. Like, let's drive relational connection by celebrating. Let's talk about the journey that it took us to get there. And if we didn't, then we need to have a harder conversation that talks about why not? What didn't we do? The extreme ownership, like that kind of lives vicariously through our organization as well. So we're going to start with what we didn't do right or well enough to achieve that goal. But that hopefully, I think within a quarter, a client who we showcase those values of excellence and relationship is going to say, like, that got pulled through even into Q1, where we said, wow, we actually are having a meeting where Harvest is showing up and saying, like, we didn't do a good enough job. We didn't achieve these goals. And here's what we're going to do to shift or we did, and let's celebrate. As well as anyone in this industry, it's so easy to not celebrate because
you got a line review next month.
Yeah,
the length
between you sold a display in and it hits the floor, 1,000 other things have already happened, and so we've got to drive a culture of celebration as well.
Yeah, no, that's great, man. Hey, as we've talked about how the weight of responsibility and how difficult it is to start with a strong culture and then make it even stronger in your own local market, let's throw in a pandemic for good measure. And see how that works. So if you think about the last 2.5 years, can you give us some examples of things that Harvest Corporate did to reinforce their culture when the team all of a sudden became dispersed on March 13th of 2020? And then one level deeper, double click what the Kroger team maybe did as a way to kind of reinforce or strengthen culture when y'all were not in the office together.
Yeah. It's funny how I was thinking about this the other day. Some of the rhythms that we have now as a culture were born out of the pandemic. Some of the best rhythms that we have as a culture are now born out of a pandemic. And some of the things that I would share will be like, yeah, of course. Now everybody does that. But at the time it was like, what? And so that's funny how time does that. But a couple of things that from a corporate culture. Consistency of connection, even when it was awkward. And so if you think about March, April of 2020, I think a lot of companies just like disconnected because it was hard. We were still figuring out Zoom, Teams. We hadn't transitioned to Teams. Nobody knew how to do a virtual team meeting. And
we'll all be back in 2 weeks anyway. So
yeah, that's right. We don't need to do this. We'll be back in 2 weeks. It'd be a fun little break. I mean, you were such an instrumental part of this, but you all just leaned in, like, hey, our team meeting is going to be virtual. It's going to be awkward, but we're gonna get into a rhythm and a cadence. So continuing the cadence of the team meeting, even when it was really hard and hard to find content and get people to engage from remotely, was one that funneled down to Kroger team is going to consistently have a team meeting, even if it's virtually. That was one. Two, the creative ways to create connection through. I know you all did this in Northwest Arkansas. We did it here. Like, hey, we can meet outside. Let's gather some people around a fire pit, or let's go to the local coffee shop, sit outside 6 feet apart. All the things when we were allowed to do that. Being intentional and designing ways for people to connect in person when it was safe and appropriate to do so was meaningful. Again, it's hard to put ourselves back in that mindset, but we just wanted to see people. Like in March of 2021, it was like, oh my gosh, I got to see Steve Blair. I can't believe it. Like, I haven't seen him in a year. We just wanted to create. So the creation of ways to connect in person was safe and appropriate. And then third, the creativity of, one of the things we did here, Ellen on our team created family movie night boxes, and we drove them out around everybody's house, and we dropped off popcorn and candy and a free movie rental through Apple TV, and said, like, hey, have a family movie night. We did another one that was a summer picnic, and I was like, all right, here we're going to drop off the coupons, and then here's a little picnic basket, like, have a family picnic. And so those things sound maybe ridiculous, but it was just like the consistency and cadence of connection and creativity. Force.
Yeah.
I did it. That's what I think was able to keep people engaged and keep culture going. Again, not without mistakes and faults along the way, but I think as I think about the successes of that period,
Yeah.
some of those are still living on now. Like the team meeting for people to be able to join remotely and in person is great. It's not like if I'm out of the office, I can't be a part of team meeting. Like that was born out of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So
I think you made the point at the beginning that, there are some things we didn't used to do ever, and now we do. And it's one of the more defining pieces of our culture, and it didn't exist 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Man, that's awesome.
You remember the team meeting of 2020 where it was all virtually, or big meeting was all virtual and like that. It would have been easy to just shelve big meeting for that year. That would have been the easy choice to do. And the fact that the company didn't was meaningful.
Yeah. Hey, last question on kind of the topic at hand. One of the coolest things I think that you've done with your team is you have a thing called the Awesome Jar. And you probably knew I was going to ask about this because I have a freakish infatuation with it. I think it's brilliant. So A, tell us about the Awesome Jar, but then B, how did the Awesome Jar spirit stay alive during the pandemic when you weren't physically in the office near the jar?
Yes. So the Awesome Jar, you mentioned Tim Ferriss, was an idea I heard on the Tim Ferriss podcast about 3 years ago. And he talked about the idea that they just have a jar in their office where when something awesome happens, people just write it down. They take the email, they fold it up, they put it in there as a signal of recognizing something awesome happened. And I love that idea. And then really I stole it. He said, then at the end of the year, we have a party and we all read it. And we talked about in this industry how celebrating is really hard because of the timing and cadence of when you get wins. We just felt that. And what I felt, we were getting further and further away. When you start something 7 years ago, if we got an email back from a buyer at Kroger, it was like a stop the day, let's have happy hour, celebrate. Like, I can't believe that happened. And then as we got further and further along, all of it just got like, oh yeah, that's what we expect to happen. And so you stop celebrating. And so it's like, I want to keep recognizing those things. And so throughout the year, whether it's personally, it ends up being a lot of personal stuff, professionally, a lot of clients. That's one of the things I wish our clients could see, because so much of it is wins for our clients. We're celebrating that wins that our clients had. And so at the end of the year, around Christmas time, we do a big celebration dinner. It's kind of our holiday party. And then we pass the jar around, and then somebody reads. And the cool part about it is like, it's not like you're reading your own thing. There's always this moment of like, I don't know the story, but I'm just going to read this out loud and then give that person the chance.
Yeah.
And so many times it is like, it happened in February and it's like, oh my gosh, I completely forgot that even happened. Like that was such a big deal at the time and I've totally forgotten about it. And so for us, we had a member of our team, when we went in the pandemic, he created, I think it's Cincy Awesome Jar at harvestgroup.com. And so it became
no way.
Email, like, hey, I can just like send it to that email, hey, this happened today, or forward the amazing email to that email, and it just compiles it. And then we printed those emails off at the end of the year, so we could keep this. And then we did it was virtual, right? It was a virtual, pass the mic around a Zoom. And again, was it amazing? Probably not, but was it memorable? Like, do people still talk about, like, I can't believe we did the Awesome Jar virtually one year. And so it's my favorite. It's my absolute favorite thing that happens every year. And I hope people who experience it, they're just at the end of the night, there is a lightness of like, oh, that was awesome. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Man, I will tell you, as the person who felt the responsibility, it was in my title, to maintain culture, right? To build culture and to enable culture development at Harvest Group. I will never forget the night I got invited to go to Cincinnati and to participate in your Awesome Jar. And it was unforgettable for a number of reasons. One, it's just an amazing experience to watch your team relive the highlights of the year. But for me, as the leader responsible for keeping an eye out for culture, to see that play out in real life with having been nothing to do with it. Like that was my idea. It wasn't, in fact, I'm not even sure you told me you were doing it until like right before you invited me to the dinner. Right. But to see that's a great example of how a remote office or a dispersed team takes this idea of recognition and celebration from corporate harvest, makes it their own in Cincinnati. It is accretive to the overall culture of harvest. It's not disconnected. It's aligned. Yeah. It's authentic to you. It's authentic to your team. And the fact that other offices at Harvest don't do an awesome jar is great.
Yep.
You know, normally, in fact, I probably tried to, hey, Beth, you have to do an awesome jar. And hey, you know, Josh, you have to do an awesome jar. And the fact that it's yours and that it's owned by your team, and the fact that you've innovated on it over the years, that was just like seeing culture naturally evolve in the wild for me was like an amazing experience. And it's a testament to the 3 levels of culture that we talked about: the total company, the local team, and then the team leads that have sub teams. That will forever be an example of how I think that actually, like in the wild, plays out in such an impactful way.
Well, I appreciate that. You made a good point there. That was driven by the fact that Total Harvest Group Northwest Arkansas has the gratitude party.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like, I've got to figure out a way. We're not going to throw a party where, we had 2 clients at the time. We're not going to throw a party. We've got to figure out a way to bring that to life in Cincinnati in a unique way, an authentic way. So yeah, I hadn't thought about that until just now.
Man. All right, Nick, I'm going to hit you with a couple of speed round questions.
Yes, I love it.
And then we're going to go to the questions and see if we've got some folks in the chat that want to ask questions. First speed round question. We've mentioned Tim Ferriss already. With the obvious exception of 60 Songs That Explain the 90s by Rob Harvilla, is there a podcast that you religiously listen to? You listen to it on the day that it launches every time. And if it's not about culture or where you pick up ideas from culture, what's the second podcast that you like to go to for ideas around culture?
Yes. I knew we were going to talk about podcasts.
Of course we were
prepared to talk about podcasts. There's a podcast called Coaching Real Leaders. It's published by the Harvard Business Review. I like it because it's only 20 minutes, and that's about my attention span and my drive to work, which is one that I listen to when it comes out. That's what I'm listening to. And then I'm literally scrolling through my podcast feed right now, Steve, because I'm trying to, how much of the other 2 I would say is I've historically been a How I Built This fan. Even I think for me as an entrepreneur or entrepreneurially minded person, I think so much of the content out there is about the mythology of the founder and the founding story, or the glorious exit but there's so very little about the messy middle. And the reality is, like, we're all living in the messy middle. I mean, it's like you and I can have this conversation now about how great it was to build culture. Like, we're still in the middle of that, right? As we sit here. So that's one. That would be the second one. And then I'm an Enneagram person, so there's a podcast.
Okay, so what I was just about to say was you've dropped Harvard Business Review 3 times, but you haven't made a single mention of Enneagram, and now you go and mention Enneagram.
I know. Well, here's the concern. I don't know who's going to be the audience. I wanted to sound smart. I mean, so I figure if I say Harvard Business Review a couple of times, people go, wow, that's probably inauthentic to my.
This guy's brilliant.
Yeah, just so Typology. This is a podcast too. As I think about. Hopefully to tie it to here, like, you can't it's really hard to be a leader delivering authentic culture if you don't know yourself. And so as I started at Harvest 7 years ago, I look back at that, I don't know if I knew myself all that well. I knew who I was within the halls of P&G. I knew who I was within the halls of the public accounting firm, but my time at Harvest and through the study of the Enneagram has allowed me to learn who I am authentically, good and bad. And then lead in that manner. So those would be the 3. And when we're done with this, I'm going to think about 3 others I should have said.
Well, that's awesome. Spoken like a true Enneagram 7. Who's going to continue to live life on the edge and figure out the next 3.
Got it.
All right, last question. And I was going to go here as well. If you could encapsulate the spirit of your Harvest Kroger culture in a song, and it can be lyrics or it can be tone and feel, what song would play as you're trying to live out authentically the culture of Harvest Kroger?
By the way, I just want to say thank you for giving me a little bit of heads up on this question.
You knew I would. Yeah.
As you know, like if I'm going to karaoke and someone's like, what's your favorite karaoke song? It's like I've never heard any music before. Like I'm like, I've never heard any songs before. I don't know any. So that's what you would have got.
By the way, for those of you listening, it's Mo Money, Mo Problems by Notorious B.I.G. Go ahead.
Is that how we're going to finish out? That'd be fun.
Yeah.
There is a song called Drive by Need to Breathe. And I love that band in general, but that song is as I was thinking about this, it it's really built off the emotion of running downhill. And so that's the chorus is like while we're running downhill, and that emotion of like the excitement, the fear, the fear over and over again. And we feel that as trying to build something from scratch. We feel that I think in a corporate environment, you feel it, maybe once a week, once a month, a little bit more protected. Not that there's anything wrong. That's how it's built. Here, we feel it 15 times a day. The highs and lows just happen so much, and it feels like you're running downhill. And then there's the momentum of running downhill. And one of the lines in the song says, "These hills take longer than we think to get down." And we feel that at times, where it's like, we should be done. We should be off this roller coaster. Like this, when's the season of rhythm happen? And like, well,
yeah,
I don't think it's going to happen. And so I think if you worked here for a week or for a month, it's fun for me when people start in the office and we say that, like, hey, highs and lows are really high, the lows are really low, and they happen 12 times a day. It's like, okay, sure. And then 3 months in, they're like, yes, that was right. So not only do I love that song, but I think it encapsulates a month in the life of working probably at Harvest Group anywhere, but certainly at Harvest Group in Cincinnati.
Yeah, man, that's awesome, Nick. Man, I think we could agree this could be a 2-hour conversation. We could pivot deeply into Enneagram and podcasts. But man, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being my inaugural guest on this conversation about leadership and culture. Matt, I believe you're going to help us curate if there's any questions in the chat. I'd love for you to chime in.
Indeed, I am.
We can go for it.
Indeed. Nick, first of all, thanks for what you said about the messy middle. I've spent most of my entrepreneurial career in the messy middle. It's fun listening to you talk about it. A couple of great questions from Mark, and I'm going to add it to a question that I had written as well. Are people this is my part, are people attaching to teams and organizations differently? In what ways are rewards, recognition, and celebration changing to remain relevant? And now what Mark said was, how important is it to have friends at work? So the question broadly is, how are we changing, and how are leaders stepping up to meet those changes?
Yeah. I love that question because I actually have an opinion on this. I think what I've seen happen, who knows whether my opinion matters or is right or wrong. What used to matter, I'm being ridiculous, but it were macro awards. Like the annual sales meeting award, that's what everybody looked forward to. Did you hit your firm forecast number mattered? I think you can see so many companies that have popped up to facilitate this. What matters now is micro recognition and micro awards. I think people, including myself, want to be recognized for the little thing that I did, that somebody just says like, hey, I know there's a lot of them out there. Like here's 5 points or whatever. And like a note that says, and you're building up points towards things. So I think just personally, I feel like, I'm a words of affirmation person, but I think we've all become more words of affirmation coveting as we are maybe remote working. We're not in the environment on the everyday basis where somebody can tell you in person. And so what I try to think a lot through, what are the micro recognition and micro rewards we can offer versus waiting until the end of the year to offer the big sales or award. I just find it more meaningful as people have evaluated, like it's helpful for my leader or my team or somebody I work with to recognize me in the micro ways in the moment versus in a macro big way.
How amazing is it to receive a text message out of the blue from somebody saying, hey, I was on that Zoom call, you nailed that closing of the pitch, or you know, my goodness. And text messages take 4 seconds to send.
And I mean, technology follows the culture. And so, or maybe it leads the culture, but you can see all the tech companies that are like micro reward systems that are being built into companies' ethos systems now is to to be able to do that. That's following the way that we're all desiring to be recognized in the moment now.
Let's not miss the friends at work part. Asked by an individual named Mark Stamps,
Yeah.
which is hilarious. Talk about that, Nick.
Mark Stamps is my friend at work. I think the importance among the many things you could talk about, having a trusted outlet. One of the things that happens, especially in that messy middle, and as we talked about the roller coaster, failure happens a lot. And as we're all wired to, well, not all, as many of us are wired to want to win or to achieve or to succeed or be perceived as succeeding. When you're not, and you don't have an outlet to be vulnerable to, or as someone trusted who you can call and say, I don't think I'm doing very well. And here's why. That's the importance. And Mark has been that person for me, and to be able to call and just say, like, I can be authentic, not in my successes, but in my failures and in the things that I've not done up to the levels I would have hoped to, or that didn't go the way that I thought. We have to have someone at work to do that, and then to celebrate with. It's much more fun to celebrate with your friends. And so I think both of those, but for me, having someone who I can be vulnerable in the roller coaster ride of emotions has been impactful for me.
Yeah, that's great.
I didn't realize how good that question was until I heard the answer. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
Another question. Do you have an example of a time where you had to deliver tough feedback, and how did your culture help enable a more productive outcome?
This is great. I wanted to talk about this. So personalities of leaders often have a massive impact on culture. The Harvest Group culture, set by our founder, CEO, Ross Culley, who is great at giving feedback and does it in a detailed, structured, empathetic, action-oriented way, because that's how he's wired as an Enneagram 8. I'm an Enneagram 7, who at my unhealthiest will flee negative emotion. And so what I've realized, this is an example of macro culture having an impact on micro culture. Left to my own devices, building culture from scratch without a greater macro culture, I would naturally drift towards not giving critical feedback because it causes negative emotion. And that's something I'm actually, trying to flee in my worst of times. So for me, there has been a significant impact from that macro culture set before I joined Harvest of we are a feedback culture. We deliver it empathetically. We deliver it with clear expectations, and we deliver with clear actions and next steps. That has had such an impact on my ability to do that. Just to be clear, I still don't do it all that well. But I was thinking about that in preparing with this. Like, that's an example of where something that was created before I started has impacted the way I lead here in Cincinnati, where I think it would be different if that wasn't already in place.
Man, that's incredible, Nick. I think about, and this is unique because I have an intimate front row seat for the Harvest culture over the years, but I also think about, in regards to feedback, when you can anchor your feedback in the values of the company, there's that common vocabulary we talked about, right? Like, there's words that people understand and recognize. And so I know two of your values are relationship and journey. And so I remember a time when I had to give some tough feedback, and I set it up as, hey, I know you want to get to this level. I know you want to get this additional responsibility. I really would like to give you some real-time feedback after a meeting that happened 5 minutes ago. And I feel like the relationship that we have built has earned the ability to be frank with each other. And so I care enough about you, our relationship. I care enough about you. I care enough about our relationship to offer you some tough feedback because I know you want to get here on your journey. And for that, I think that message did land very differently than if I just said, hey, that meeting didn't go real well. Like, let me give you 3 or 4 points of feedback on it.
When trust is at the root of feedback and development, that has to be first. When that is established, when that exists, one of the best things I've ever heard about feedback is, like, the more consistent it is, the less it hurts. Because you're expecting, it's not out of the blue. Well, one of the things that I've fell victim to is, like, I give feedback at the mid-year touch point. It's like, wait a minute, that hurt. You've been thinking this for 6 months and haven't given, like, if it's more, when there's a foundation of trust, if there's not a
Yeah.
foundation of trust, the more consistent it is, the more it hurts. So, but if there's a foundation of trust, I am for you. You've told me how you want to grow. I'm just here to help you grow. You've asked for me to be a part of this growth journey with you. When that trust exists, the more consistent it is, the less it hurts, because it's meant to be beneficial. And so
and that's authentic. It's coming from an authentic place of connection.
Yeah, that's a place I'm still actively working. So
yeah,
I do not speak from expertise in that manner.
Well, man, Matt, I think that's all of our questions. Nick, I can't thank you enough for being a friend, for being a leader I look up to, and for being my first guest on Conversations on Retail, and specifically Conversations on leadership and culture. So thank you for joining. Thank you everyone for joining in and asking some questions. This recording will be uploaded on the Conversations on Retail website. So hopefully you can go back and take a look. But thanks for joining us, and we'll be back in, I think, 2 more weeks with our next episode. Thanks for joining us.